Hi, everybody. Professor Gaida here today to talk to you about moves in poetry. There they are. And we'll talk about a couple of different kinds of ways that poems move and that poets move in poems. Probably the most important way that poems move and that poets move in poems is moving from thought to thought or image to image or thought to image or image to thought, right? Um, a thought is obvious. I don't think I need to define what a thought is. But the direction of thought can be linear, right? Well, logical. I say this, therefore you expect me to say that, and what comes next. But it can also be associative, right? We have a thought, and then it reminds us of something, or it leads to a thought we didn't expect, kind of goes sideways. That's very common in poetry. And it's the kind of movement of thought that we see a lot, and that you will probably practice a lot. And then an image is um, a, it's a concrete thing in the world that we represent with language that appeals to the senses, right? So what does that mean exactly? And you can read some of this yourself, but just to say that, the way that we relate a thought to a thought or an image to an image is what matters in poetry. And by relate, I mean move from one to the other. So here's an example of the ways that a thought can move to a thought and can be complemented by an image or can move from an image to a thought, right? This is a poem called My Father's Accent by a contemporary American poet named Kaveh Akbar. And the poem starts off with this line, a boy prettier than me who loved me because. So it starts off with an image, a boy prettier than me. Okay, and we can picture that in a number of ways, but it's an image of something concrete in the world, a boy. And then we get a thought related to the boy who loved me because my vocabulary and because my orange pills. Okay, so the idea that this boy, this person in the world, this image, interacted with the speaker, loved me because my vocabulary and because my orange pills. And then another thought, once asked me to translate my father's English. Okay, so it's like a little story. The speaker knew this boy, and I use the word speaker, not poet, because the speaker is not always the poet, right? The speaker is the voice telling you whatever the voice is telling you in the poem. Has an identity that might be the poet or it might be somebody else. So anyway, the speaker is telling you this little story about a boy who loved him. Okay, great. That's one thought, and it comes from that beginning image. And we jump to the next stanza or group of lines, and there's a new thought. This poem wants me, the speaker, to translate it to. Oh, okay. So we jump from this story of a boy to now a comment on this poem. This poem wants me to translate it too. And we assume that by it, he means his father's accent, right? His father's English. Okay. And then in the next line of this stanza, the speaker jumps to another thought, kind of calling the poem names and also calling his hands names. Idiot poem, idiot hands for writing it. So that's those thoughts are related, but they didn't have to follow one another, right? They're thoughts they're associative thoughts. They're connected, but not in a direct line. This is just how the poet's mind moved. When you write a poem, I want you to not be afraid of how your mind moves, even if it doesn't make logical sense, even if it isn't you or your speaker explaining something. Not every thought or sequence of thoughts needs to be explained, and that's really important, right? Especially in a poem that relies on suggestion, and it relies on suggesting ideas and thoughts to other people so that they can think about them. Okay? So don't be afraid of the way your thoughts move. Let them move that way, as Akbar is doing this poem, right? And then after the second stanza, where he goes from the boy to an idea, two ideas about the poem, he gets back to this idea of his father's English. An accent isn't sound. Hmm. Only to those to whom it seems alien. Oh, that's an idea about who is hearing the accent, right? So only to those, who are these people to whom the accent seems alien? Well, in this case, not a person, it's a poem. And in this case, it's that boy, right? Only they would think that the accent is sound, would flatten an accent to sound, right? So now we're to a third idea entirely, and that is a comment on not the poem, not the story about the boy, but a comment on accents and the nature of accents and what they mean, right? So the idea here, in this third poem, the important idea is that an accent means more than just the sound of it. It isn't just something that sounds different, right? It does require maybe some kind of translation. Okay, I will erase our little markings here and talk to you now about the next group or the next category of movement that we see in poems, and that is this category of movement through technique, right? Using different poetic techniques or patterns or little tricks, if you want to call them that, to move the poem along, to help move the poem from idea to idea, thought to thought, right? Image to image. So a poem makes all these moves by organizing thoughts and images and presenting in language that leads our minds in certain ways. Doesn't explain everything, but it leads us through a series of thoughts and images that we can then, in our own minds as readers or as listeners, try to make sense of. So the poet might jump quickly from an image to an image, might describe an image differently in different lines, and we've seen that already. And a poet might use techniques like changes in rhythm to reinforce an image or thought. A stanza break, a new stanza, or a break in the line, a new line to lead us to a new thought. Or might repeat a word or a phrase. Repetition and pattern usage is very common in poetry, right? So we'll see a couple of examples of that here. This is another contemporary poem by another American poet named Sally Wenmow, and it's called The Toll of the Sea. I'll read it to you. The first Technicolor feature in Hollywood, a retelling of Madame Butterfly starring Anna May Wong. Green means go, so run, now. Green, the color of the siren sea, whose favors are a mortgage upon the soul. Red means stop before the cliffs jag downward. Red, the color of the shore that welcomes. White, the color of the man washed ashore, from his shirt to his pants to his brittle shoes. White, the color of the screen before Technicolor. White, the color of the master narrative. Green, the color of the ocean, so kind, not leaving a stain on the white shirt. Green, the color of the girl, so kind, but why? She speaks. Alone in my garden, I heard the cry of wind and wave. In the green girl's garden, the stranger clamps her, asks, how would you like to go to America? A lie, soaked in the red of the choke cherries that turn brown in the heat. Red, the color of the roses that spy. Okay. So there are a few techniques that move people along. The first that's sort of noticeable is something called allusion, right? An allusion just means reference to something significant. And that word is really important, significant, right? Why is that word important? because it signifies something, right? So if something is significant, it actually signifies, which means it has some cultural meaning or some symbolic meaning, some meaning that has resonance with people who read it. So in this case, we're talking about a movie, Madame Butterfly. But it's not just a movie. Madame Butterfly is based on an opera by Giacomo Puccini, and it's about an American sailor who goes to Japan and makes promises to a Japanese woman who's got a child, promises that, he will love her and take her to America and they will be happy. And then he abandons her. And within this story are all kinds of overtones of um, Western male dominance and Eastern female submissiveness, right? And so there's an allusion to this story. There's and more than an allusion, there's kind of a retelling of it. And there's an allusion to the actress who plays Madame Butterfly, who's got another name, but is called Madame Butterfly by the sailor. So the pattern after that illusion, you see a different technique here, and that's called repetition, right? It's a kind of repetition. We see it here. Green, green, red, red, white, 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 green, green. Okay. It's a way to use, in this case, not just a repetition of the word, but repetition of a color to connect thoughts, to move readers from thought to thought. And when it comes at the beginning of a line like this kind of repetition of a word or a phrase, it's got a special name. It's called anaphora. You don't have to know that, but just know that this idea of repetition is really, really important. Okay. And because it's pattern, and we use pattern a lot to move people along through poetry. So far we have illusion, we have repetition, or anaphora, and I'll just put here, kind of repetition. Okay. And then we have other techniques along the way, right? You see more repetition, color, 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 green the color, white the color, blah, blah, blah. Okay, repetition all the way down. And then we get to this interesting technique here, a line that doesn't start with a color, and it sets up another voice in the poem. So you can have the speaker's voice and also have a second or third voice in the poem speaking, right? Almost like dialogue. And here it's Madame Butterfly. Alone in my garden, I heard the cry of wind and wave. So Madame Butterfly is speaking. And then the sailor speaks. How would you like to go to America? So this is a multi-voiced, I'll just call it multi-voice, multi-vocalic poem if you want, but a multi-voice poem. Okay, and that's another technique to move people from thought to thought, the way the dialogue does. And then finally, we go back to this repetition, but there's also the use of something that I'm sure everybody is saying, I don't see when they read these first two poems that we're looking at, and that is rhyme. So finally, this poet uses a little bit of rhyme to tie some thoughts together. And how does the rhyme tie thoughts together? Well, it connects lying and spying, right? And that's kind of what's going on here. The sailor uses the woman as almost like a conduit of information and then leaves her. Okay, so you see how we can use these different little simple poetic techniques to kind of move people from thought to thought, right? Through color and different images, cliffs, the shore, the man washed ashore, the screen before Technicolor, right? An image, an image, an image, and we're connecting those images through the repetition of these colors. So, that's one way, but you can imagine, you yourself can imagine literally probably dozens of ways to move people through different techniques through a series of thoughts or a series of images, right? And that is largely what poems do. So you don't have to know the names of all these techniques. but you'll read some poems that show you other people using them, and then you'll consider your own variations or twists on what people do as a kind of technique that can help you. Okay? So that's all we're going to say for now, but just be aware that you will always be, as a poet, making moves from line to line, sometimes within a line, to make to move the readers, move your audience from one thought to the next, from one image to the next, from a thought to an image, to a comment, maybe, right? And that's the way that poems generally work, right? You don't have a lot of room, so you're making these moves that aren't necessarily logical, but that connect in some sort of a pattern or association. And we will talk much more about this. Okay. Thank you, folks.